Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parshas Bo, Tavshin Pei Vav 5786. So we're going to begin in the Parsha where the Jewish people have left Egypt. They've just left. And we're going to start from Parakid Beis, chapter 12, Pasuk Lamites, verse 39. Vayoifu es habatzek, and they baked the dough, asher hotziu mitzrayim, that they took out from Egypt, ugois matzos, matzah cakes. Kiloi chametz, for it had not leavened. Ki garshim mitzrayim, for they had been chased out from Egypt. V'lo yachlu ismamei, they were not able to remain. The gamtzei de lo yasu lahem, and they also did not make provisions for themselves. Now, this is a famous pasuk. We mention it on the Seder night when we talk about the reason for eating matzah. And again, they baked the dough that they took out from Egypt as matzahs, for it had not leavened, for they were chased out from Egypt. So why did they bake the dough as matzah and not as chametz? Why? So the pasuk seems to say, Ki garshim mitzrayim, because they were chased out of Egypt and they couldn't tarry. So the reason why they baked the dough and they didn't wait for it to become chametz was because the Egyptians chased them out. That's how we would seemingly read the pasuk. Ramban Nachmanides explains it differently. He actually explains the first part of the pasuk where it says that they baked the dough that they took out from Egypt, for it had not risen, had not leavened, is because it was Pesach, and they were not allowed to have or eat chametz. And therefore, you know why they baked it as matzah, for it had not leavened? Because they weren't allowed to. It had to be matzah. So what is the second half of the verse that says, Ki garshim mitzrayim, they were chased out from Egypt and they couldn't remain? That's the reason as to why they didn't bake it before they left. Because if you read the pasuk, the pasuk is pretty clear. They baked the dough that they took out from Egypt. So why did they bake the dough that they took out of Egypt? Why did they bake the dough out of Egypt? Why didn't they bake the dough while they were still in Egypt, which would have been matzah anyway because it's Pesach? But why did they have to do it? Why did they do it when they took it out and not while they were still in Egypt? The answer is Kigarshim Mitzrayim, because they were chased out of Egypt. The Egyptians didn't let them stay. So therefore, as the Ramban writes, and therefore they carried out that dough, and they hurried and they baked it before it would become chametz, before it would leaven, baderech, on the way, or in a place called Sukkos, which in a few verses we will see that was their first stop. When they got there, l'shah kala, in a very quick amount of time, as our sages have taught. Meaning their trip from where they were in Egypt to this place called Sukkos was something that basically they got there in a miraculous amount of time. And he's saying that, okay, it was Pesach, it couldn't be chametz, it had to be matzah, but they couldn't bake it before they left because they were chased out, so they still had to bake it before it became chametz. So he says they hurried and they baked it before it became chametz on the way or in Sukkos, which he says we know they got there in a very short period of time. He means to say, and therefore, even though they all had to leave Egypt before they were able to make the matzahs, they got to Sukkos quick enough to be able to bake the dough before it became chametz. And that's miraculous. For the entire Jewish people to be able to leave Egypt and have enough time to still bake the dough into matzah before it became chametz, that's pretty incredible. But that's what he says what happened. And I think the same idea has to be said when it says that they quickly baked it. He says on the way or in Sukkos. That means on the way, even though, okay, fine, it meant like right when they got out of Egypt, they baked it. But we're talking about the entire Jewish people coming out of Egypt and still having enough time to bake it before it became chametz. I think it's all part of that same shoakala that he says that very quick amount of time, as our sages taught, applies to that too. And that is why they were able to bake it before it became chametz. So again, Ramban's approach here is that what they baked when they left Egypt was not chametz, it was matzah because it was Pesach. The reason they baked it, reason they had to take it out as dough and not bake it inside Egypt, is because they were chased out. And therefore, they had to they had to bake it either on the way or in Sukkos before it became chametz. That's how the Ramban explains. The Orach Chaim, commentary of Orach Chaim, follows the approach of the Ramban, that the reason that they baked it as matzah is because they weren't allowed to eat chametz, it was Pesach, and therefore they had to make sure to bake it quickly as matzah. Now, he says, now he addresses the problem of, okay, well, it was dough. That means it was already kneaded. And they had to bake it before it became chametz. That's going to take some time between kneading it and finally making it what they did. So how did they deal with that? So he has an approach like this. The halacha is that the dough, when something becomes a dough, if you leave it still, then the leavening process takes place. But if you basically move it around or you press on it, that is going to impede the process. And therefore he says that perhaps what they did is that the whole time when they carried the dough, they moved it around, they pressed it, they made sure it didn't become chametz, as I just explained. And he explains the fact that it does say, and for this we have to go back a little bit because we're going to go back to this verse anyway. This is again in Perek Lamed Tes, in chapter 39, and it's Pasuk Lamed Daled, verse 34, which is talking about when they actually left. Vayisa ha'am es b'tzeikai, terem yachmatz, the nation carried the dough before it became chametz, again, which is repeated here later on, what we just read. Mish'areisem tzireis b'semleisem al shichmam, with their leftovers tied in their garments on their shoulders. So where did they carry this chametz? On their shoulders, together with all those other things mentioned. The vayisa ames b'tzeika, they carried it, as the pasuk says at the end, al shichmam, on their shoulders. So says the Orach Chaim, they had to carry it on their shoulders. They couldn't put it anywhere else. But the answer is, by having it on their shoulders, they were able to work on it, to manipulate it, so it shouldn't become chametz. That's why they carried it instead of putting it in somewhere that they could load it onto something and carry it that way. Rashi on that pasuk says the reason why they carried it was because since this was the dough. Let me just see Rashi. Right. Even though they had many animals with them that could carry things for them, but they showed belovedness to the mitzvah. This was the dough that they had. I mean, it's the dough that they had from the leftover from the Korban Pesach. It was the dough that, they were going to bake matzah from. But Rashi says that because it was the mitzvah was beloved to them, they don't want to put other animals, they want to carry it themselves. That's Rashi. And we're going to see Rashi has a different approach here. But Orach Chaim explains, like the Ramban, the reason it was matzah was because it was Pesach. They had to deal with making sure that it didn't become chametz before they baked it. And the Orach Chaim says they did that by holding it and manipulating it the whole time until they could get to the point where they could bake it. Okay. So that is the approach of the Ramban. Rashi has a different approach. And Rashi is on the pasuk, the earlier pasuk that we just read, which is again Perek Yud Beis, chapter 12, pasuk Lamed Daled, verse 34. And there Rashi says, on the pasuk, Vayis ames b'tzeikai terem yachmatz, the nation carried the dough before it became chametz, before it became leavened. Says Rashi, terem yachmatz, they carried the dough before it became chametz. Hamitzriyim lohinichum lishos kadei chametz. The Egyptians did not allow them to wait there for enough time for it to become chametz. So Rashi is saying, you know why it didn't become chametz? Because the Egyptians chased them out. It didn't become chametz because they didn't allow them to stay there long enough for the dough to become chametz. And that is what the pasuk, and according to Rashi, the later pasuk Lamed Tes 39 that repeats this. They bake the dough that they took out of Egypt as matzah cakes were not leavened. They were chased out of Egypt, and that's why it didn't become chametz. Rashi doesn't say that here again because he says on the verse before. But the reason it wasn't chametz was because the Egyptians chased them out. So the Ramban says it wasn't chametz because on Pesach they couldn't eat chametz, and Rashi says that it's because when the Egyptians chased them out, they didn't give them enough time for the dough to rise, for the dough to become chametz. Okay, so the commentary on Rashi, known as Gur Aryeh, which is from the Maharal of Prague, so he explains that the reason why Rashi does not learn like the Ramban is not because of the fact that there was a prohibition of chametz. They didn't allow it to become chametz. Because as he says, Pesach Mitzrayim lo noyeg eloyim echad ke'isa b'perek mishahaya. The Talmud in Tractate Pesachim says, this is a really different opinions about this, but he works with the opinion, Rashi worked the opinion, that in Egypt, they didn't have 7 days of the prohibition of chametz. The prohibition of chametz basically was on the first night. First night, when they eat the korban Pesach, it was matzah, which we know. The Torah says, al matzah merim yechlu, you eat it with matzah and maror. It's matzah. So that night was matzah. But after that, on the first Pesach of the Jewish people, there was no more prohibition of chametz. And therefore, says Rashi, the reason why they couldn't bake it regularly is not because of a prohibition of chametz. There was no prohibition of chametz. But it was because, practically speaking, they didn't have enough time to do it because the Egyptians chased them out. And okay, now the next question that has to be dealt with is the fact that earlier in Pasuk Tesvav, verse 15 of this same chapter, before the Jewish people leave, when Hashem tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people about the korban Pesach, about the Paschal sacrifice, well, he also talks about the holiday Pesach. And it says in Pasuk Tesvav, well, it says, Pasuk Yudal, verse 14, Shivas Yomim, Matzos Teichelu, 7 days you'll eat matzahs. On the first day, all sourdough has to be removed from your house. Anybody who eats chametz, that soul will be cut off from the Jewish people from the first day to the 7th day. All right, well, so Hashem tells Moshe, the Jewish people, about a holiday called Pesach, that for 7 days, you can't eat chametz. For 7 days, eating matzah here doesn't mean you have to eat matzah. According to Torah law, you only have to eat matzah on the first night. Whenever the Torah talks about eating matzah for 7 days, it really means to say, and it mentions it more explicitly also, when it says, by day 1, it says, and it's chametz will be cut off from day 1 to day 7. So the point of the pasuk is that we have this prohibition of chametz for 7 days. Now, it's important to know that the prohibition of chametz, why we have a prohibition of chametz is the same reason why we have a mitzvah to matzah. As we say in the Haggadah, we have a mitzvah to matzah because the bread that they ate had to be matzah because they were chased out. That's what we say in the Pesach Seder. And that's the idea behind chametz too. Not eating chametz is the same commemoration. It's the same idea of that because the Jewish people left in a hurry and their dough did not become chametz, that's why we have a prohibition of chametz too. So the Gur Aryeh now has to deal with the following question: if he said that the Torah is working with the fact that there is that on the first Pesach there wasn't a prohibition on the first day of Pesach, right, on the day of the 15th, there was no prohibition because there was only one night. There was only a small amount of time that the prohibition was prohibited. Had to be observed on the first Pesach. It wasn't 7 days. So if it wasn't 7 days, why did the Torah already tell us about the 7 days? At this point, there are no 7 days. There's eventually going to be a 7 days, but right now there isn't. And the right now, and even if you'll say it's talking about the future of 7 days, but the reason for the prohibition of chametz for 7 days hasn't happened yet. They didn't leave yet when it was being told. And therefore, what's the point? If we're saying that there is no prohibition presently, and not only that, there's also the fact that the whole reason isn't relevant yet because it hasn't happened yet, then why is the prohibition being mentioned? Especially since it's not even happening right now. So Gur Aryeh cites the Ramban Nachmanides that says that the reason was because, you're right, the reason didn't happen yet, and it wasn't relevant now. But Hashem already told Moshe and the Jewish people that there's going to be a holiday where chametz will be forbidden on 7 days. The reason for it hasn't happened yet. Hashem knows the reason why it's going to happen. And right now he told them this law. They didn't necessarily understand the reasoning behind the law. They didn't know that reason behind the law. But Hashem knows what's going to happen, and he already told them about it now. That's what Ramban says. Okay. So then the Gur Aryeh goes into his explanation as to why Hashem told them about this prohibition before the reason even happened. Why he gave it to them and told it to them before it even happened, and again, even before it's relevant. Because it has a relevance now, according to the Gur Aryeh. And he explains like this. He explains that the reason behind the whole being rushed out, we have this concept, we have this idea that we focus on a lot on Pesach. We were chased out. We were chased out before the dough became chametz. What's that about? What was that all about? Why was it so important to be chased out like that? So the Ramban says, so Gur Aryeh explains that the point was like this. The point was that Hashem wanted the Jewish people to see that when they are leaving Egypt, they're leaving Egypt because of Hashem's power over the Egyptians. When they leave, Hashem wants them to recognize and see that they are leaving because Hashem is forcing the Egyptians to have them leave. And he writes, so that could happen if the Jewish people aren't really ready to leave because their dough hasn't risen yet. And the Egyptians will chase them out before it could rise, meaning that would have been the regular situation to do. Wait for it to be able to become chametz, wait for it to rise, and then leave. No. The Egyptians were chasing them out before that. And through that, they would see Hashem's strong hand, strong power over the Egyptians. Would it have been that the dough would have risen first? They would have left willingly. You don't be chased out. It's time to leave. The dough has risen. Apparently, that would have been enough. I don't know if he means something to think about it right now. I don't know if he means, they would have baked it right then and there also. It doesn't sound like that. It sounds like it's enough if the dough would have risen, right? At least the dough would have been ready, and they would have gone ahead and they would have taken care of it. Because again, remember, according to the Gur Aryeh, there's no prohibition of chametz right now. So in essence, to carry out the dough and maybe bake it later, okay, no big deal. But at least wait for it to rise, at least for it to become ready. And if that would have happened, then they would have left. There would have been no need for the Egyptians to chase them out. And then that kind of power and strength that Hashem has over them, that Hashem is forcing the Egyptians to make them leave, they weren't able to see that. And therefore, that's why he took them out in this manner. The Egyptians would be chasing them out. They'd be scared, as the Pasuk says, they're scared for their lives. They're chasing them out because they are petrified of Hashem. That means that the Egyptians are having them leave all because of Hashem's power and strength over them. That's what Hashem wants the Jewish people to see when they're leaving. It should be very clear to them when they leave until the last minute, even after all the plagues. When they're leaving, it should be very clear to them that they are being taken out by the hand of Hashem, and by the power of Hashem, and that would be clear. Now, if they would leave because everything is ready to go, so they would just leave. But now that they were leaving, they were forced out because the Egyptians were terrified from Hashem. That now shows the Yad HaChazak, the strong hand that Hashem has over the Egyptians. Therefore, he says, Ulefikach kaidem hayetzia. Therefore, before they even left, his or Isam, he told them about the prohibition of chametz. Meaning, according to the Gorar, he wants to say that when they were told the prohibition of chametz before they even left, they knew why. He was letting them know that this is the manner that he wants to redeem them. He wants to redeem them in a way that their bread will not become chametz. They should know that with the strong hand of Hashem, he wants to take them out. And this is all Hashem orchestrating this to happen. He told it to them beforehand. They shouldn't think, well, this happened this way. They chased us out. They couldn't handle us anymore. They chased us out. No. So the Gorar is saying that Hashem told them the mitzvah then. And I'm assuming that he means with the explanation behind it, with the understanding behind it, that you're gonna have a prohibition of chametz because when you leave, you're gonna leave before that bread is ready to become chametz. You're gonna leave before that dough is ready, because you need to leave in a way that it should be clear that it's Hashem's hand, Hashem's strength over the Egyptians by which you're leaving. And so therefore, when the Egyptians come and they're chasing them out, they know why it's happening. They're knowing that this is Hashem orchestrating that they should leave in a manner that it's clear that they are leaving because of Hashem's strength over the Egyptians, which again is manifest in the fact that the Egyptians are chasing them out because they're so terrified of what Hashem can do. And they were told about it beforehand through that mitzvah, which wasn't even going to be relevant at that point of time, but he told them about that future mitzvah so that they should understand what's going on. Don't just look at the Egyptians chasing you out as, well, that's how it's happening. That is Hashem's orchestration of showing his strong hand over the Egyptians when they leave. And that's what they were being told. So that's how the Gorar again, following Rashi's approach, that there was no chametz issue at this point of time, just that the Egyptians chased them out in order for them to, and that's why the bread didn't become chametz. And it was about understanding, seeing, and making and having it clear that they are leaving by way of Hashem's strength over the Egyptians, and that would be seen by the fact the Egyptians were so terrified of Hashem, of what Hashem could do to them anymore, that's why they just chased them out. And they were told about this previously through the mitzvah of 7 days of chametz that eventually they would have. They would understand they're being chased out by the Egyptians in order to and Hashem is doing it this way so that they see that they're being taken out through the strength of Hashem's hand over the Egyptians, and not because they were ready, and not because just happened to be this way, that they chased them out. Okay. Now, next thing I want to mention is the fact that I'm going to kind of leave this as a question. So, again, we have the Ramban, who says that the reason it wasn't chametz was because it was Pesach and they couldn't eat chametz. And Rashi says there was no, according to the Gorar, the Rashi does say that they didn't become chametz. Doesn't say because it was Pesach. Rashi says because the Egyptians chased them out before it could become chametz. Now, I mentioned before that we mentioned this pasuk by the Pesach Seder, and by the and in the Haggadah of Pesach, towards the end of the Maggid section of the Seder, we talk about the 3 mitzvahs of the night and their reason. So when we get to matzah, we say matzah zu she'anu oichlim. This matzah that we eat, al shuma. Why? Why do we do it? Al shum shleihisbek b'tzeikam shel aveiseinu lahachmitz. Because the dough of our forefathers didn't have a chance to become chametz. Until God revealed himself upon them and redeemed them. Shenamar, as it says, they baked the dough, took out from Egypt as matzahs, kilei chametz, where it did not become chametz, ki garshim mitzrayim, because they were chased out of Egypt, lo yachlu smameya, they weren't able to wait. Now, whose reason fits into this part of the Seder? I mean, according to the Ramban, the reason why we're eating matzah is not because our dough didn't have enough chance to become chametz until Hashem redeemed them. It was because it was Pesach. And the wording here of the Seder of the Haggadah is pretty clear that the reason why it didn't become chametz is because it didn't become chametz when Hashem revealed Himself to redeem them. Meaning, there was something about the redemption going on that didn't allow the chametz to become chametz, which, according to Rashi, means the fact that the Egyptians chased them out. Now, you can ask that if the reason was because the Egyptians chased them out, so why does the Haggadah say it didn't become chametz before Hashem revealed Himself and redeemed them? It should say because the Egyptians chased them out, which is as the pasuk says, as the verse says, the verse quoted says. So the Gur Aryeh says, according to his explanation, that's the meaning about until Hashem revealed Himself to them and redeemed them, because the Egyptians chasing them out wasn't just the Egyptians chasing them out. That was Hashem orchestrating that they leave in this manner in order to see Hashem's strength over the Egyptians. So that's why it's called until Hashem revealed Himself, because the Egyptians chasing them out was Hashem's orchestration to redeem them in the specific way of seeing His strong hand. So that's why it's called Hashem revealed Himself and redeemed them. But again, it's about what happened as they were leaving. That's a simple explanation. As they were leaving. But not just because it was Pesach. So it seems to be a question on the Ramban's approach, and I'll leave it in a question. I don't have an answer for it right now. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful evening.